In 1939, a woman was committed to Michigan's largest psychiatric institution. The paperwork listed no release date. Welfare workers said she was unfit. Their evidence? She refused to accept charity on their terms. She wouldn't stop writing political letters. She wouldn't give up her children. 24 years later, those children finally got her out. By then, she didn't recognize their faces. Her youngest son, the one she'd raised on ideas that terrified the state of Michigan, grew up to become Malcolm X. This is the story of Kalamazoo State Hospital and the people it swallowed whole. To understand what happened to that woman, you have to go back almost a century before she arrived. In the 1840s, Michigan was barely a state. It had been admitted to the Union in 1837, and within a decade, the people running it had a problem they did not know how to solve. The mentally ill had nowhere to go. Families locked them in attics. Towns chained them in cellars or threw them into county jails alongside criminals. Those considered harmless were simply turned loose to wander the countryside, sleeping in straw stacks and abandoned buildings like animals. In 1848, Governor Epaphroditus Ransom pushed the legislature to act. The result was Public Act 187, which authorized the construction of Michigan's first asylum for the insane. The site selection was not exactly impartial. Ransom himself was from Kalamazoo, and so Kalamazoo it was. But the planners had one condition. The original location, in what is now the Stewart neighborhood, was rejected because it was too close to downtown. They did not want respectable citizens anywhere near these people, so they chose a remote hilltop instead, far from the center of town, and they built a road to reach it. They named that road Asylum Avenue. Construction began in 1854. The architects followed the Kirkbride Plan, a revolutionary design championed by Philadelphia psychiatrist Thomas Story Kirkbride. The idea was radical for its time. Kirkbride believed that architecture itself could heal. His asylums were built in a batwing pattern, with staggered wings radiating outward from a central building so that every ward received natural light and fresh air. Two massive Kirkbride buildings rose on that hilltop in Kalamazoo, one for women and one for men. And when the Michigan Asylum for the Insane formally opened on August 29, 1859, it was supposed to represent the most humane treatment available anywhere in the country. The first superintendent, Dr. Edwin Van Dusen, took the job seriously. Under his watch, the asylum pioneered methods that would not gain widespread acceptance for decades. But even in those early years, not everyone inside agreed that the reality matched the promise. A patient named Lydia Adeline Jackson Button Smith would eventually publish a book about her time at the Kalamazoo Asylum. She called it Behind the Scenes, or Life in an Insane Asylum. In it, she accused Van Dusen himself of gross neglect and what she called willful and premeditated wrongs. She wrote that people were being detained who were not actually insane, and that ignorant and unprincipled attendants were employed to manage them. The book was published in 1878. It was one of the earliest first-hand accounts of life inside an American psychiatric institution, and it would not be the last time someone questioned what was really happening behind those walls. But the institution kept growing. For a time, the growth looked like progress. By the turn of the century, the Kalamazoo Asylum was racking up a list of firsts that no other state hospital in the country could match. Linda Richards, widely recognized as America's first professionally trained nurse, served as superintendent of nurses from 1906 to 1909. The hospital established the first outpatient psychiatric clinic in Michigan in 1916. It created one of the nation's first schools of occupational therapy in 1922. It pioneered a home boarding program that placed patients in certified community homes, an idea so far ahead of its time that it sounds like something invented in the 1990s. And then there was the Colony Farm. In 1888, the hospital purchased hundreds of acres of farmland several miles from the main campus and built a network of cottages designed to look like vacation homes. Patients with milder conditions lived in those cottages, tending Holstein dairy cows, raising chickens in a working hatchery, and growing vegetables in sprawling gardens. The idea was that fresh air and honest labor could do what no medicine of the era could. It was the first farm colony for the mentally ill in America. At its peak in the late 1940s, the colony farm operation alone spanned nearly 800 acres. The hospital as a whole ran its own bakery, laundry, library, cannery, greenhouse, power plant, water system, and garage. It had a piggery, an orchard, and multiple farms scattered across the Kalamazoo region. Children grew up on the colony farm grounds. In 2019, a woman named Wanda Boykout was interviewed about being born and raised at Pratt Cottage, one of the colony farm residences where her parents worked as caretakers. She lived her entire childhood surrounded by patients. By 1959, the Kalamazoo State Hospital owned over 1,300 acres of land and housed 3,500 patients with a staff of 900. It was a city within a city, the biggest employer in Kalamazoo, and the road that led to it was still called Asylum Avenue. A self-contained city of 3,500 people on a road called Asylum Avenue, and most Americans have never heard a word about it. If you are one of them, tell me in the comments. Because what comes next is the part of the story that Kalamazoo does not put on its tourism brochures. In 1929, the state of Michigan passed Public Act 281. It authorized the sterilization of patients in state institutions as a measure for preventing mental illness. By 1931, forced sterilizations were being performed at Kalamazoo State Hospital. The logic was eugenics, the pseudo-scientific belief that mental illness, criminality, and poverty were hereditary traits that could be bred out of the population. Michigan was one of 32 states where these procedures were legal. Nationally, more than 60,000 Americans were forcibly sterilized in institutions just like this one. The programs targeted women disproportionately. They targeted minorities. They targeted the poor. And they were funded by some of the most powerful organizations in the country, including the Carnegie Institution and the Rockefeller Foundation. The Race Betterment Foundation, one of the earliest and most influential eugenics organizations in America, was founded just 60 miles from Kalamazoo in Battle Creek, Michigan, by J. H. Kellogg, the same Kellogg whose name is on your cereal box. The eugenics program was not the only failure. In 1954, a 21-year-old student nurse named Marilyn Cray was strangled to death in the basement of the receiving hospital by an 18-year-old patient with a documented history of violence. Hospital officials blamed chronic understaffing. The asylum was state-funded, and it was, in their words, ever at the mercy and whims of legislators who were more concerned with budgets than with the safety of the people inside. But the darkest failure of Kalamazoo State Hospital was not a single act of violence. It was something quieter, something that lasted 24 years. Louise Helen Norton. Little was born around 1897 in the village of La Digue on the Caribbean island of Grenada. Her grandparents, Jupiter and Mary Jane Langdon, were Africans who had been freed by the British Royal Navy from intercepted slave ships and resettled in the Caribbean. Louise grew up speaking 3 languages: English, French, and patois. She was educated, she was fiercely political. And by the time she immigrated to Montreal in 1917, she had already joined the Universal Negro Improvement Association, Marcus Garvey's movement for black self-determination. In Montreal, she met Earl Little, a Baptist minister and fellow Garveyite. They married in 1919 and moved to the American heartland to build Universal Negro Improvement Association chapters. They had 7 children together. Louise served as a chapter secretary. She edited publications. She taught her children to read the Negro World, Garvey's newspaper. And for this, the family was hunted. The Ku Klux Klan drove them out of Omaha. The Black Legion, a white supremacist group, burned their home in Lansing, Michigan in 1929. In 1931, Earl Little was found dead on the streetcar tracks. The official ruling was accident. The family believed it was murder. Louise was left alone with 8 children in the middle of the Great Depression. What happened next is one of the most quietly devastating sequences in American history. State welfare workers began showing up. They documented her poverty. They noted that her children sometimes missed school or shoplifted food. They flagged the fact that she refused to accept pork from government relief supplies, a decision rooted in her Seventh-day Adventist faith, and they interpreted it as irrational behavior. They flagged her political correspondence, her refusal to stop writing letters to Universal Negro Improvement Association chapters, her insistence on keeping her family together rather than placing her children in separate foster homes. All of it, every act of resistance, every expression of independence, was written down and used as evidence that this woman was unfit. On January 25, 1939, the court orders were signed. Louise Little was involuntarily committed to the Kalamazoo State Hospital. The commitment papers did not include a release date. Commitment marked her life. Her children were scattered into foster homes across Michigan. The family she had fought so hard to hold together was dismantled in a single afternoon. Her son Malcolm, who was 13 years old, would later write about it with a grief so cold it reads like fury. He wrote that they took her to the state mental hospital in Kalamazoo, and that they were state children, court wards, a white man in charge of a black man's children, nothing but legal, modern slavery. Louise Little spent 24 years inside Kalamazoo State Hospital. 24 years. Long enough that by the time Malcolm visited her for the last time, in 1952, she no longer recognized the faces of her own children. Historian Eric McDuffie, who has spent years recovering Louise's story from the archives, frames her commitment not as a medical decision, but as a punitive one. The state targeted her because she was proud, because she owned her own land, because she refused to bow. Her land was seized, her children were taken. The woman who had organized political movements across 2 countries, who spoke 3 languages, who had sheltered Marcus Garvey himself in her home, was locked inside an institution and forgotten. In 1963, Malcolm X and his siblings finally secured their mother's release. Louise lived with family members for the rest of her life. She died in December of 1989 at approximately 95 years old. Malcolm never got to see her free. He was assassinated in 1965, 2 years after she walked out. He wrote in his autobiography that he dearly loved his mother and blamed the state for destroying her and her family. Without Louise Little, there is no Malcolm X. She was not just his mother, she was the origin of everything he became. By the 1960s, the institution itself was already in decline. In 1963, a young man named Larry Raines spent 10 days at the hospital after a suicide attempt and was released. 5 months later, he committed the first of several murders. He and his brother Danny would become the only known family in American history to produce 2 serial killers operating independently of each other. Both died in prison. But by then, the institution had bigger problems than the people it had failed to catch. The introduction of antipsychotic drugs like Thorazine had changed everything. Patients who had been locked inside for decades were suddenly responsive, able to care for themselves, and returning to their families. The population dropped from 3,500 to 550 by 1987. Budget cuts from the state accelerated the collapse. In 1980, 88 employees were laid off and 160 patients were released in a single stroke. And in 2000, Governor John Engler's administration gutted what remained of Michigan's state-run psychiatric hospitals, pushing patients into community-based care at private agencies. The Kirkbride buildings that had defined the campus for over a century were torn down. The male department was demolished in 1939. The female department followed in 1969. Most of the hospital's 1,500 acres were transferred to Western Michigan University, which turned the grounds into a healthcare corridor, research facilities, and a nursing school. Students now walk to class over land where patients once farmed, lived, and died. And beneath their feet are the tunnels. The Kalamazoo State Hospital had one of the most extensive underground networks of any asylum in the Midwest. The passageways connected every major building on the campus, running beneath wards, kitchens, and utility buildings. Staff used them to move between buildings in winter, when the Michigan cold made surface travel miserable. When the colony farm was abandoned in the late 1960s, the tunnels were left behind. They became a destination for teenagers looking for something they probably should not have found. In 1971, a high school sophomore named Garrett Collins stopped at Asylum Lake with a friend and found his way underground. He described cement walls, vaulted brick ceilings, beer bottles, and dirty mattresses left behind by people nobody remembered. Sharon Ferraro, the city's historic preservation coordinator, saw the outside of one tunnel years later when a building was torn down. She said it looked like a giant worm. When Western Michigan University took over the property, facilities management dynamited the most deteriorated tunnels. Others were sealed and buried, but some may still carry heating or electrical lines beneath the surface of the campus. Today, only 2 original 19th century structures survive on the Kalamazoo State Hospital grounds. The Gate Cottage, a small carpenter Gothic building with gingerbread trim, now serves as a museum. And the Water Tower, 172 feet tall, built in 1895, listed on the National Register of Historic Places. You can see it from miles away. Every fall, thousands of freshmen arrive at Western Michigan University and walk to class past that tower without knowing what it marks. They study nursing in buildings constructed on land where patients were once sterilized against their will. They jog the trails around Asylum Lake, where the colony farm cottages stood, and the tunnels still run beneath the dirt. The road was quietly renamed. The Kirkbrides were torn down, but the Kalamazoo Psychiatric Hospital still technically operates in a reduced form in the shadow of the university that consumed its grounds, a ghost of what it was. Louise Little walked through those gates in 1939 and did not walk out until 1963. The buildings where she spent those years are gone. The road is no longer called Asylum Avenue, but the water tower still stands, and the ground remembers what happened here, even if the rest of the country forgot. This is Ward Files. Subscribe if you want to hear the next one. And if your family has any connection to Kalamazoo State Hospital, we want to hear your story in the comments.